There is a community in Ekiti State right now where a pastor is dead. He was killed during an evening church crusade. Gunmen stormed the gathering, opened fire, shot him down in front of his congregation, and abducted several worshippers, women and children among them. The kidnappers subsequently contacted the victims' families with a demand, 1 billion naira. That is the price they placed on Yoruba Christian worshippers, taken from a church in Elejemeje local government area of Ekiti State in April 2026. 1 billion naira for people who are gathered to pray. Now, the traditional rulers of neighboring communities responded to this attack with a call that has split Ekiti State, inflamed national discourse, and raised a question that goes far deeper than the security incident that triggered it. They called for an immediate ban on night church services. They said that late-night religious gatherings were making communities vulnerable and that the ban was necessary for security reasons. Now, hold that statement. A pastor is dead. His congregation is in captivity. The kidnappers are demanding 1 billion naira, and the institutional response of traditional rulers, the Obas, the custodians of Yoruba community authority, the men whose palaces are supposed to be the last word on community safety and civic order, is not to condemn the attackers. It is to restrict the church. Now add the second layer of this story. Simultaneously, in the same news cycle, in the same geographic corridor, in the same communities where this church attack happened, over 30 Kwara State traditional rulers have fled their palaces. Not visiting, not traveling, fled, taking refuge in Ilorin, in Osogbo, in Ofa, in Lagos. Some have been absent from their domains for months. Others have been gone for nearly a year. Communities in Oreke Okegbo, Omugo, Afin, Olongtele, Alabe, Ganwaileri, and Igwagbo have effectively been abandoned. Palaces empty, markets inactive, schools shut, farms inaccessible because armed groups have made those territories ungovernable. The Baale of Ogbayo in Okeode was killed in his palace in September 2025 after gunmen invaded at dawn. The Olukoro of Koroikiti, Oba Olusegun Mukole, was killed in his palace while his wife was abducted in February 2024. The Ojigbara of Bayaganile, Oba Kamilu Salami, was taken from his farm in November 2025 and held for 25 days until a ransom was paid. The monarch of the Olainka community in Ifelodo LGA was abducted from his palace along with his wife. The kidnappers demanded 400 million naira. In December 2025, gunmen invaded the residence of another monarch, kidnapped him and his son, a corps member, and held them while his community scrambled to raise 30 million naira for his release. He was still receiving medical treatment at the time of the most recently available reporting. In the olden days, a community leader said, "No one dared to touch a king." Today, our monarchs have abandoned their palaces. These are not statistics. These are named men, named communities, named palaces standing empty, named markets where trading has stopped, named farms where food is not being grown because the people who grow it have run away. Now, put all of this together and ask the question that this investigation is built around. What is actually happening in Yorubaland? Not in the abstract, not in the framing of Islamization that the headlines are using, and that this investigation will examine carefully and critically, but in the specific documented operational reality of 2025 and 2026. What force has made over 30 Yoruba traditional rulers abandon the seats of their authority? What force killed a pastor during evening worship in Ekiti State? What force is demanding 1 billion naira for Christian worshippers taken from a church in Ekiti? And what does the call to ban night church services made by traditional rulers who are themselves fleeing their palaces tell us about the state of governance, security, and civic authority in southwestern Nigeria right now? Before we go further, if you are new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media is too afraid or too compromised to deliver. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. Let us establish precisely what happened in Ekiti, the sequence, the actors, and the specific institutional response, because the details are what separate analysis from noise. The Eda Oniyo community in Ilejimeje local government area of Ekiti State. An evening church crusade. Gunmen arrived, opened fire, killed the presiding pastor, and abducted an unspecified number of worshippers, including women and children. The Eda of Eda Oniyo, Oba Joseph Awolola, confirmed on Wednesday, April 30th, 2026, that the kidnappers had contacted the community with their demand of 1 billion naira. He said in an interview, and these are his words, that the abductors told them they want 1 billion naira and that they are still on Eda land, in the forest, waiting. Ekiti State's Special Advisor on Security, retired Brigadier General Ebenezer Ogundana, visited the community alongside Commissioner of Police Michael Faladi for an on-the-spot assessment. They assured residents that a coordinated rescue operation was underway and urged the public to provide credible intelligence. They said, and this is the language of Nigerian security officials who have been saying the same thing in different communities for 15 years, that they are on top of the situation and by God's grace, the victims will be rescued. The traditional rulers of neighboring communities then called for a ban on night church services. Their stated rationale was security, that late-night religious gatherings create predictable targets that armed groups exploit. Now, examine that rationale with the analytical precision it requires. The security concern is real. Evening and nighttime gatherings in communities with compromised perimeter security, inadequate lighting, and no reliable emergency response capacity genuinely are more vulnerable than daytime gatherings. This is a documented operational reality in multiple conflict-affected communities across Nigeria's southwest, middle belt, and northwest. Armed groups do exploit predictable gathering patterns. The tactical observation that nighttime church services create vulnerability is not factually wrong. But there are two questions that the ban proposal does not answer and that this investigation must ask directly. The first question: who is making the community vulnerable? The answer is the armed groups. The response to armed groups making communities vulnerable is to address the armed groups through security deployment, through intelligence, through community protection mechanisms, through the kind of sustained state presence that converts ungovernable territory back into governed territory. It is not restricting the activity of the law-abiding citizens whose safety the state is constitutionally obligated to protect. Banning nighttime church services does not make the armed groups less dangerous, it makes the Christian community less free. Those are not the same outcome, and they should not be conflated. The second question: would the same ban be proposed if the attackers had targeted a night market, a nighttime political rally, a midnight Ramadan gathering? The analytical test of any security restriction is whether it would be applied equally across all activities that create equivalent vulnerability, or whether it is being applied selectively to one specific religious community's gatherings. The answer to that question, in the current political context of the Ekiti communities making this call, is not one that the traditional rulers have publicly addressed, and the absence of that address is itself a data point worth examining.
Now look at the Kwara monarch story, because it is inseparable from the Ekiti story even though they are being reported separately, and the connection between them reveals something more significant than either story alone. Over 30 Kwara State traditional monarchs have fled their palaces. The communities most affected are in Kwara South, in the Igbomina and Northern Yoruba territory that sits at the geographic and cultural intersection of Yorubaland, and the territory through which armed groups operating from the north have been progressively advancing southward since 2021. The communities of Oreke and Oreke Oke Igbo have been largely deserted since June 2025. The attack on a marble mining site in Oreke Oke Igbo on June 4, 2025 killed 2 police officers, Assistant Superintendent Haruna Watsai and Inspector Tukuru Oga. After that attack, Samuel Afolayan, a palace worker, described how the violence escalated from livestock theft to kidnapping to killing, and how the exodus followed. He said, and these are his documented words, that initially the attackers were just stealing food and livestock. Then they started kidnapping and killing. That was when everyone began to leave. He said that as of the time of his interview, he had not been to Oreke since June of the previous year. The king is not there. The palace is empty. The entire community is deserted. Even neighboring villages have been abandoned. The affected monarchs have been traced to urban areas: Ilorin, Osogbo, Ofa, Lagos. men who hold sacred traditional offices that Ekiti culture, as documented in the state government's own cultural records, describes as divine kingship, whose installation involves solemn and lengthy rites that set them apart as the reincarnation of their ancestors back to the founding of their dynasties. Men who by ancient custom rarely appeared in public except on ceremonial occasions, whose palaces are described as the center of their towns and kingdoms. Those men are now living in Ilorin and Lagos and Osogbo because staying in the center of their communities means dying. Ransom demands in the documented cases range from 40 million naira to 400 million naira. In one case, the Olainka community monad, the initial demand was 400 million naira. In others, negotiations brought the figure down, but as a source involved in one of the negotiations said, even the reduced figures require families to sell property or borrow money they do not have. A community leader in Ekiti, LA, Adebayo Ojo, said that the royal fathers must speak with one voice, that people expect leadership at a time like this. But here is the reality that statement does not acknowledge. The royal fathers cannot speak with one voice when they are in different cities trying to survive. The people cannot receive leadership from kings who have fled because staying will kill them. The governance vacuum that their absence has created, the inability to make community decisions, the acceleration of insecurity without traditional authority to anchor community response, the psychological devastation of watching the most sacrosanct institution of Yoruba civic life abandon its post, that vacuum itself is the violence's most institutionally significant effect.
Now, examine the Islamization question, because it is in the headline, it is in the public discourse, and it requires the most careful and precise analytical treatment available. The word Islamization, as it is being used in the discourse around these events, refers to a specific claim that the armed groups attacking Yoruba communities, abducting Yoruba monarchs, and killing Yoruba pastors during church services are not simply criminal enterprises motivated by financial gain. That they are, at least in part, instruments of a deliberate project to displace Christian Yoruba communities, weaken Yoruba traditional governance structures, and create the conditions for expanded Islamic influence in the Southwest. This claim is made by specific named actors. It is made by the Igbomina liberty advocate, Abdul Rauf Bello Labella, who explicitly connected the attacks to what he described as the installation of Seriki, a Hausa Fulani title for a community leader on Yorubaland, and the granting of land to what he called aliens. It is made by community leaders across Kwara South who have pointed to the pattern of attacks, which communities are targeted, which are spared, who the attackers appear to be, and where they appear to come from. It is made in the specific accusation embedded in the community leaders' documented statement that some traditional rulers harbor the bandits, give them land, allow them to intermarry with the natives, create markets for them, and install Seriki on Yorubaland. This investigation does not dismiss that claim, nor does it accept it wholesale. It examines it with the evidentiary standard this channel has applied across every investigation in this series. What the documented evidence confirms is this. Armed groups operating in Kwara South and the Ekiti-Kwara border corridor have demonstrated a pattern of targeting that includes specific geographic progression, moving southward from territories that have been made ungovernable northward into Yoruba communities that previously had no experience of this scale of insecurity. They have targeted traditional rulers specifically, not randomly, not incidentally, but with the specific effect of eliminating the primary governance authority of the communities they enter. They have targeted churches specifically. The Eda Onio attack was not a robbery that happened to occur at a church. It was an attack on a church gathering. They have demanded ransoms at a scale 1 billion naira that is not simply criminal opportunism, but appears calculated to destroy communities' financial capacity to sustain themselves. What the documented evidence does not conclusively confirm, and this distinction is analytically essential, is a single centrally directed Islamization project with identified commanders, identified funding sources, and identified political objectives at the level of deliberate territorial conquest. The attacks share characteristics with Fulani herdsman militia violence documented across the Middle Belt. They also share characteristics with a criminal banditry networks that have progressively expanded southward from the northwest and north-central states. They also intersect with illegal mining operations. The Oreke Okeigbo attack at the marble mining site was a documented trigger for displacement. These motivations are not mutually exclusive. Criminal, ethnic, and ideological motivations can coexist in armed groups whose composition and command structures shift depending on the specific operation being conducted. What is analytically certain is this. Regardless of whether the primary motivation is criminal, ethnic, or ideological, the effect is Islamization in its functional sense. The progressive displacement of Christian Yoruba communities from their territory, the weakening of Yoruba traditional governance authority, and the creation of conditions that make Yoruba communities more vulnerable to external cultural, religious, and political influence than they have been at any point since the colonial period. Effect, documented and verifiable, is what governance must respond to. Motive, contested and complex, is what courts and intelligence agencies must establish. Conflating the two produces either denial of a real problem or premature attribution of a single cause to a multi-causal crisis.
Now examine the political response, because the governance failure documented here is not only about the armed groups. It is about the state. The Ekiti State government sent a security advisor and a police commissioner to the community. They assured residents of a coordinated rescue operation and urged the public to provide credible intelligence. This is the standard Nigerian state response to a community security crisis. Official visit, assurance of ongoing operation, request for public intelligence that has been repeated in hundreds of communities across the country for 15 years without producing a fundamental change in the security trajectory of any of them. The Kwara State government has not, in the available public record, deployed any security architecture that has reversed the displacement of over 30 traditional rulers from their communities. The communities of Ore and Ore Okeigbo have been deserted since June 2025. That is 10 months of a state government knowing that its traditional rulers are in Ilorin and Lagos because their palaces are too dangerous to occupy, and the situation has not changed. The Kwara State government's security response has been documented in its absence more than in its presence. The socio-political advocate Bello Labelabe said explicitly that there has been no meaningful improvement in security in Ifelodon LGA, despite warnings that have been issued for years. A community leader said directly that the traditional rulers harbor the bandits, give them land, know them, and cannot pretend they do not know them. An accusation that, if accurate, points to a level of complicity or coercion in the traditional governance structure itself that the state government has not investigated or addressed in any documented form. Now raise the federal dimension. Because Ekiti and Kwara are states, and their security challenges are partly beyond any state government to address unilaterally. But the federal government's presence in the security crisis affecting these communities is not visible in the public record in any form proportionate to the scale of what is happening. Over 30 traditional rulers have fled their palaces. A pastor has been killed during worship. 1 billion naira is being demanded for abducted Christian worshippers. Entire communities have been deserted for nearly a year. And the federal government's documented engagement with this specific crisis in terms of security deployment, in terms of intelligence coordination, in terms of public communication from the presidency or the National Security Advisor is not in the public record in any form that suggests the crisis has received the federal attention it deserves.
Compare this to the federal government's communication response to international criticism of Nigerian security from the U.S. Congress. When Ted Cruz introduced the Nigerian Religious Freedom Accountability Act, Tinubu's government mobilized public statements within days. When Trump designated Nigeria a country of particular concern, the information minister responded within 48 hours. When American officials described violence against Nigerian Christians, the Nigerian government produced a formal denial within the week. The same Nigerian federal government's public response to over 30 Yoruba traditional rulers fleeing their palaces and a pastor being killed during church worship in Ekiti, in the same political moment as the U.S. designation, is not comparably visible in the public record. That asymmetry, rapid response to the narrative, slow response to the reality, is the governance failure at the center of this investigation.
Now, examine what the community leaders' accusation against the traditional rulers themselves reveals, because it is the most uncomfortable dimension of this story and the one that Nigerian media has handled most carefully. The community leader said, and this is documented in the Punch reporting, that our kings have their share of the blame. They harbor these bandits and criminals. They give them land. They know them. They cannot pretend they do not know them. They allow aliens to intermarry with the natives. They create markets for them. They install Seriki for them on Yorubaland. This is not an allegation from a political opponent or an ideological adversary. It is an allegation from within the communities being destroyed, from a community leader watching his neighbors flee and his community collapse. And it points to a specific institutional dynamic that the Islamization framing cannot fully explain. If traditional rulers are installing Seriki, the Hausa Fulani community leadership title, on Yorubaland, the question is not only why the armed groups are advancing. The question is why the institutional authority that is supposed to resist that advance is facilitating it. The answers are not simple. Some traditional rulers may be doing so under coercion, accepting the presence of Seriki-led settler communities because refusing would mean violence against their own people. Some may be doing so for economic benefit. Land allocation to migrant herder communities can generate income in areas where the formal economy has collapsed. Some may be doing so out of genuine civic hospitality. Yoruba communities have historically accommodated diverse populations. And some, and this is the accusation that the community leader's statement implies most directly, may be doing so because the governance vacuum that their own institutional failure has created has made them dependent on the armed groups that the Seriki networks are connected to. None of these explanations are comfortable. All of them are analytically serious, and all of them point toward the same conclusion: that the security crisis in Kwara South and Ekiti corridor is not simply a story of external armed groups invading innocent communities. It is a story of institutional breakdown at every level simultaneously: federal security architecture, state governance capacity, and traditional authority that has created a vacuum into which armed groups, criminal networks, and ideologically motivated actors have simultaneously moved. Now, address the counter-arguments. The strongest counter-argument to the Islamization framing, and it must be engaged seriously, is the criminal economics argument. The armed groups attacking Yoruba communities are primarily motivated for financial gain. The kidnapping for ransom economy is a sophisticated criminal enterprise that targets wealthy individuals and vulnerable communities across religious and ethnic lines in Nigeria. Traditional rulers are targeted because they are community authority figures whose communities will pay to recover them. Churches are targeted because evening gatherings of people who have traveled from different locations create a predictable concentration of targets in an isolated setting. The 1 billion naira demand for the Eda Oniyo worshippers is not an ideological statement. It is a criminal valuation of the leverage that a large group of abducted worshippers creates. This argument has significant evidential support. The ACLD data supports a multi-causal interpretation of the violence in which criminal motivation is primary or co-primary across many of the documented incidents.
The response is not to dismiss the criminal economics argument, but to insist on its incompleteness.
Criminal enterprises require enabling environments. They require territory that state security cannot patrol, communities whose governance has been weakened enough that collective resistance is impossible, and economic incentives that make ransom payment more viable than security investment. All of those enabling conditions have been progressively built in Kwara South and the Ekiti corridor, through the displacement of traditional authority, through the installation of Seriki-led settler networks that create information asymmetry between armed groups and state intelligence, and through the governance vacuum that the state has allowed to develop over years. Whether the armed groups are primarily criminal or primarily ideological, the infrastructure that enables them is the same. And that infrastructure has been built under the institutional watch of the Kwara and Ekiti State governments, under the security architecture of the Nigerian federal state, and, as the community leader's accusation suggests, under the acquiescence of some of the traditional rulers who are now fleeing the consequences. The second counter-argument is the proportionality argument on the ban of night church services. Traditional rulers face an impossible security dilemma. They cannot guarantee the safety of nighttime gatherings because they do not control the security environment. The ban is not anti-Christian. It is a harm reduction response to a situation in which the state has failed to provide the security that would make the ban unnecessary. Criticizing the ban without addressing the security failure that produced it misplaces the accountability. The response to this argument is precise. The traditional rulers who are calling for the ban are the same traditional rulers who have been unable to prevent the installation of Seriki communities on Yorubaland, who, by the community leader's account, know the bandits and cannot pretend they do not. Their authority to restrict Christian worship in the name of security is not separable from their failure to exercise equivalent authority over the conditions that made the restriction seem necessary. A governance authority that restricts the victims of insecurity while failing to address the sources of insecurity is not performing harm reduction, it is performing selective governance. And in the current political context of what this channel has documented across this entire series, the direction of that selectivity is not analytically neutral. The third counter-argument is the most important one, and it comes from within the Christian community itself. The ban on night church services, whatever its political implications, may save lives in the immediate term. A community that refuses to restrict its religious gatherings out of principled opposition to the restriction and then loses more people to violence has paid a price that principle cannot restore. Sometimes, survival requires temporary tactical accommodation that does not amount to permanent surrender. This argument is correct and must be acknowledged. The safety of worshippers is not abstract, it is the lives of specific people. Oba Awolowo is managing a crisis in which 1 billion naira is being demanded for his community members' lives. His call for a temporary restriction on night services in that immediate context has a security logic that this investigation does not dismiss. But the response is this. Temporary tactical accommodation becomes permanent structural concession when the state fails to restore the security conditions that would make the accommodation unnecessary. Nigeria's history is full of temporary restrictions on Christian community activity in security-compromised environments that became permanent features of those environments as the state failed to recover the security terrain. The ban on night church services in Edda or Neo must be accompanied by a documented timeline of security restoration, specific deployments, specific operations, specific measurable outcomes that define when the restriction ends. Without that accountability framework, it is not a temporary harm reduction measure, it is the beginning of a permanent reduction in Christian community civic freedom in a Yoruba town where a pastor was just killed for preaching the gospel.
Where does this go from here, and what should Nigerians be watching? The most immediate indicator is the outcome of the Edda Onio rescue operation. The security officials who visited the community said they are on top of the situation. The kidnappers said they are still on Edda land with the abducted worshippers. Those two statements cannot both be true in the way both sets of speakers intend them. Watch for whether a rescue is announced, whether it is a genuine military operation that recovers the victims and neutralizes the armed group, or
whether it is a ransom payment dressed as a security operation that recovers the victims but leaves the armed group intact and free to conduct the next abduction. Watch for whether the over 30 Kwara State traditional rulers return to their communities. Their return or continued absence is the clearest available indicator of whether the security situation in Kwara South is genuinely improving, or whether the official assurances of ongoing security operations are producing operational reality or press releases. Each additional month of their absence is a month in which the governance vacuum that enables the armed groups deepens. Watch for whether the Ekiti and Kwara State governments establish any formal accountability mechanism for the security operations they have announced. Specific deployment numbers, specific operation dates, specific outcomes, arrests, recoveries, neutralizations. Without that accountability framework, security assurances are not security policy, they are security theater. Watch for whether the federal government makes any public statement that acknowledges the specific crisis in Kwara South and the Ekiti corridor at a level of specificity and commitment proportional to the scale of what is happening. 30 traditional rulers out of their palaces, a pastor killed during worship, 1 billion naira demanded for abducted worshippers. If that combination of facts does not produce a specific, named federal security response within the current political moment, it will tell you with precision where the Tinubu administration's security priorities actually sit. And watch for whether the Islamization discourse, which is now publicly present in Nigerian political conversation in ways that it was not 12 months ago, produces any federal government engagement with its substance rather than its framing. Denying the narrative without addressing the conditions that produce it is the same governance failure this channel has documented across the Sharia series, Operation Safe Corridor investigation, and the CLIR investigation. The pattern is consistent. The cost is accumulating.
Here's the answer to the question this investigation opened with. What is actually happening in Yorubaland? A governance architecture is collapsing, simultaneously at 3 levels. The federal security architecture has not deployed resources proportionate to the scale of the threat advancing into the southwest corridor. The state governance capacity has not converted security assurances into operational reality. And the traditional authority structure, the Obas, the custodians of Yoruba's civic identity, the men who by ancient custom are supposed to be so sacred that bandits cannot go near where they are, has been driven from its palaces by armed groups that some of those same rulers, by documented community account, have accommodated rather than resisted. Into that triple governance collapse, armed groups, criminal, ethnic, and in some documented cases ideologically shaped, have advanced. They have killed a pastor in Ekiti during evening worship. They have abducted worshippers and demanded 1 billion naira. They have deserted communities that were inhabited for centuries. They have made Yoruba kings into refugees in their own land. The call to ban night church services is the most visible institutional response to all of this, and its visibility is precisely its problem. It restricts the most vulnerable, the Christian worshippers who were already targets, while leaving unaddressed the conditions that made them targets. It is governance directed at the symptom while the disease advances. In the olden days, no one dared to touch a king. Today, over 30 Yoruba kings have left their palaces. The question is not whether what is happening constitutes Islamization. The question is whether Nigeria's institutions have the capacity and the will to stop what is happening before the communities that those kings were supposed to protect are no longer there for them to return to. Here is my question for the comments. The traditional rulers of Ekiti communities have called for a ban on night church services in response to a church attack that killed a pastor. The same traditional rulers have been unable or unwilling by community accounts to install Seriki communities on Yorubaland. Do you believe the ban on night church services is a genuine security response, or is it the first formal institutional concession to the armed presence that is reshaping the demographics and governance of the Yoruba Southwest? One answer. Drop it below. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.